The United States. It's been called a lot of things: a modern Roman Empire, a beacon of liberty. But really, it's a nation that was born from conflict. Today, we're going to dive into the key struggles that forged this country, a story filled with compromise and constant reinvention.
I mean, think about it. It's a nation that has completely shaped the modern world. A real military and cultural giant whose influence you can feel in just about every corner of the globe. So, how did it get here? Well, to really understand the America of today, you've got to go back, way back to the very beginning. So let's explore the defining struggles that forged its identity, starting with the very first clash of worlds.
Okay, part one, a clash of worlds. You see, the story of the United States doesn't really begin with a founding. It begins with a collision of vastly different worlds.
Long before any Europeans showed up, North America was already home to hundreds of really sophisticated societies. I'm talking complex communities that had thrived for millennia. This wasn't some empty wilderness. It was a populated continent with its own rich and deep history.
So, after Columbus, the big European powers, Spain, England, France, they all raced to claim a piece of the continent. They were hunting for riches, for a faster route to Asia, and each one carved out their own territories, which, as you can imagine, set the stage for centuries of conflict.
But this clash of worlds had another consequence, a catastrophic biological one. European diseases, things the native peoples had zero immunity to, just ravaged their communities. It was devastating, and it dramatically altered the balance of power on the continent.
All right, part two, revolution and a new nation. So once the English colonies had a solid foothold, a totally new kind of conflict started to brew. This time, it was a struggle for self-determination. And you can really see how things just escalated over a decade. It starts with taxes, right? The Sugar and Stamp Acts. Then things get violent with the Boston Massacre. It just keeps building, all centered on this one single idea: no taxation without representation.
Well, this simmering rebellion finally just exploded. The Declaration of Independence put forward this incredibly radical new idea for the time, that a government gets its power from the people, from the consent of the governed, not from some king thousands of miles away.
So they do it. They win independence after this brutal 8-year war. They beat the world's greatest superpower. But that victory, well, it created a whole new, massive problem. Part 3. An imperfect union. Having won their freedom, the big question became, could these 13 very different states, all fiercely protective of their own interests, actually work together as a single nation? Their first shot at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was, well, a near-total disaster. It created a central government that was so weak it led to economic chaos and even armed rebellion. I mean, the irony, right? The very freedom they had just fought and died for was threatening to tear them apart. The fix was the Constitution, a brilliant new framework for government. And its absolute genius was this idea of checks and balances. It was specifically designed to keep any one branch, the legislative, the executive, or the judicial, from getting too powerful. But, and this is a huge but, to get the Constitution ratified, the framers had to make a fatal compromise. They basically kicked the nation's most divisive issue down the road. They embedded protections for slavery right into the nation's founding document. And that contradiction, it would haunt the country for decades. Part 4. A house divided. Because a nation conceived in liberty simply could not last half slave and half free. That contradiction at its very heart was going to tear it apart. And for decades, they tried to manage it. You see a series of fragile political compromises, trying to balance the number of slave states and free states as the country expanded west. But each one just delayed the inevitable. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, that was the final straw. The South saw an anti-slavery Republican president as a direct threat to their entire way of life. And just like that, the Union began to dissolve. The conflict that followed was the bloodiest in American history, a brutal 4-year war that pitted brother against brother. Just think about that number. Over 600,000 soldiers died. That's more than in all other American wars combined. So, in the end, the war settled two massive questions that had plagued the nation since its birth. First, the United States was indivisible. And second, with the 13th Amendment, the institution of slavery was finally, officially abolished.
Part 5: Rebirth and New Frontiers. But the end of the war wasn't the end of the struggle. Not by a long shot. It was really the beginning of a new, painful chapter in the nation's story. For this brief period called Reconstruction, the federal government actually tried to enforce the rights of newly freed African Americans. But the political will just faded, and a political deal in 1877 effectively ended all of it, abandoning that promise and ushering in nearly a century of systemic segregation.
At the exact same time, the nation turned its focus westward, driven by this incredibly powerful idea called manifest destiny. This belief that it was their God-given right to control the entire continent, from sea to shining sea. In that belief, it was the fuel for the final, brutal conflicts with Native peoples, and it's what ultimately cemented the continental shape of the nation that we know today. So the nation had survived its greatest test. It was reunited and it had conquered a continent. But as it looked toward a brand new century, it faced a whole new set of questions. Questions about its role in the world and about the true meaning of its own founding ideals.